had told him 1,000,000 times that if you throw up for too long, you can die. Protecting Isabel was his sacred duty, and he would do it no matter what, even if he had to die himself. It was part of the code of honor he'd adopted a few months after his sister was born, when he'd sworn himself in as a knight. This was after he'd read a book about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, which his mother had stolen for him from the library, but he wasn't playing some stupid pretend game. Even the book said that knights weren't only in the past, and anyone could be one. True, the boy had never met another knight, but that wasn't surprising since knights had to sacrifice everything to uphold the code, and that was hard, even for him. But whenever he wanted to renounce his knighthood and go back to being a regular kid, he remembered his honor, and how no one could take it away from him. Not his mother, not the cops, and certainly not this selfish asshole who wasn't going to stop Danny knew, no matter how much he begged. That Danny turned out to be wrong had nothing to do with his ability to judge men like Matthew Connolly. On that particular night, there was something about Matthew that even a very wise, very hardened 10-year-old boy, knight, couldn't guess from the man's appearance. The rest Danny had gotten right, uncannily so. It was true that Matthew was what most anybody would call rich, given his upper six-figure salary. His stock options at Astor Denning, the pharmaceutical company where he was a VP. The top-of-the-line Porsche 911 he'd bought with last year's bonus. His property investments across the city. Though he was leasing the loft where he'd lived for the last 2 years, an upscale but not intimidating place, perfect for his friendships with scientists. It was also true that he was walking quickly, not because he had a flight to Tokyo in the morning, which he'd put out of his mind, but because it felt good to move. Not as wonderful as it had on the dance floor, but still good. The idiotic humming was a carry-away from the club he'd just left, a way of remembering the woman he might have taken home with him if this were a normal night. Yet it had been anything but. At 7:30, he'd gone out to dinner with a nationally known med school professor who'd agreed to testify before the FDA on behalf of Astor Denning's new diabetes drug. Matthew's goal was to make this guy happy, to give him the right food, the right wine, the right conversation, even, if necessary, the right women. But the only thing the good doctor really wanted was to try MDMA. Ecstasy. He was recently divorced. He thought he needed a drug that would release his emotions about his ex-wife. Matthew agreed to make a few phone calls, though he hoped he wouldn't have to listen to the guy's emotions as they were released. When the doc insisted that they try the drug together, Matthew's first reaction was to smile and nod and decide he wouldn't swallow it. The illegal part didn't bother him, but he didn't want to lose control of the meeting. But then the doc said they'd know they were tripping when their pupils dilated, and Matthew realized it might not be easy to fool this doc, even if the guy was high. Whatever happened, he could not let this important contact decide he was a liar. What the hell? The E was pure, according to his source, and he had a brilliant medical professor at his side. What could go wrong? The 50-something, fat, balding doc had had the time of his life, running around the club, groping one woman after another, telling each of them, "I know I'm on X, but the way I feel about you is so intense it has to be real." Matthew was much more subdued, but he enjoyed the experience too. And he felt proud that he'd forced himself to leave the club alone, after the doc left with some blonde, even though the pill was still working, knowing it would give him a cheerful walk home, which, damn, he needed for a change. The trip to the Caymans last weekend, meetings and conference calls and putting out fires all day, whining and dining research partners 5 nights out of 7. All of this was making him feel unusually tired, though he was determined to prove that nothing had changed, despite the fact that he'd just turned 40. He was in great shape. He could always party like it's 1999, even if that particular phrase was one he kept to himself, fearing it would date him with the hot 20-somethings he invariably found himself attracted to, rather than